All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Really nice to be here today. And yeah, I'm John. I always find those introductions, you got to write something to tell you about yourself, but sometimes they sound a little funny, especially if you're an academic. Um, yeah, I want to say I'm coming from I'm in a little cabin right now. We have this. It was the homesteading cabin on our farm that we kind of redid a bit to, I don't know, to be a little more modern. So we have some internet here that's pretty reliable, so I won't cut out, I hope. But I'm coming from Treaty 6 territory, which is just southeast of Edmonton in the Miquelon Hills area. And my family, we farm here, have for 3 generations. And yeah, have really, I love this part of the world. And this is a picture just around our area that looks, I think, probably quite similar to where many of you are from in Saskatchewan. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that though I'm on Treaty 6 across Saskatchewan, I want to acknowledge the homeland of many First Nations and Métis people who've been on the land far longer than many of us. So I want to state that. This is my abstract for today, which probably to help all of you, but also help me to keep on track as I was preparing. You don't need to read that now. I just wanted to state this. So we're going to look a little bit at some of the ways wetlands sort of interact with farming practices. And this is our seed drill and tractor on our place. And agriculture is changing. We see lots of the world's changing. I guess it always is, but the world is changing a little, and we're trying to figure out a little bit how to farm effectively with some of these natural landscapes. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And, I thought I'd better prove my, loyalty to the profession and show my little seal there from the Alberta Institute of Agrologists. Um, yeah, I've been a member of that group for quite some time now, and I really appreciate so much about sort of that professional body. And I saw on those little flashing screens in advance that this is part of your continuing professional development hours, and I know exactly. I have to submit those. We call them continuing competency hours here in Alberta. But yeah, I know how important these sessions can be to fill those hours. So yeah, this is great. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about this idea of nature's smart climate solutions. You might know what it is, you might not, but I'll touch on it. Look a little bit at some of the values of wetlands on our landscapes. Think of the costs of them, particularly to the egg sector, the cropped egg sector, and use a couple of case studies, one particularly in Saskatchewan, and then also just touch finally a little bit on the policy context and personal choice. And I guess my conclusion of all of this is that the idea of conserving our natural landscapes and farming with them is complex, but maybe not so complicated. I think those are two different things. So we'll touch on that today and hope to return to that at the end. I want to start with this picture, and I want to say I call it rootedness. And this is we sent a drone up on some of our sort of like I said, bush pastures and sloughs. This is above some of our land that we farm. And as you can see, these sort of aspen poplar bush stands, some wetland or slough areas, and then moving into some of the more agricultural zone just on the horizon there. And, we're nowhere as big on our farm as some of you or your clients that you're working with in across Saskatchewan. And we have about 4,000 acres on our farm, which is actually pretty good size for this area. But I know the vast tracts of land that the Saskatchewan farms can do, so I want to acknowledge that. And I think too, a couple of years ago, I was in 2019, so 6 years ago, I had the invitation to go down to Moosomin and speak at your Saskatchewan watershed groups. And I remember before the talk, I went outside. It was at the hockey arena down in Moosomin. I don't know if any of you have been there. And I was standing outside, just sort of, I always got a few nerves before you start presenting and sort of stretching it off. And there's a group of guys standing there, and the one guy said, "Oh man, have you seen the title of this next talk? It's like the economics of wetland drainage. Man, it sounds pretty boring." I'm like, oh gosh, I better step it up. So I hope that none of you see that as much today. I'm sure you don't. But I think place matters. I think all of us, wherever you are across the province of Saskatchewan, or where I am in this sort of uh, prairie pothole or parkland region, I'm sure you love it a little bit. The reason you're in agrology is because you have a passion for the land, or the things that live on the land, the natural landscapes, and want to learn how to sort of manage that effectively for different reasons, but ways that we can carry on into the future. And I know we have, um, yeah, two little boys, the 5 and a 2-year-old. And as they're kicking around here, we want to make sure, part of my drive for all of this is just trying to make sure this love of land and place and, these kind of ugly sloughs and kind of scrappy bush, they actually learn to love it and think about it in a different way, not just something necessarily that needs to be changed and moved around. So nature-based climate solutions. Take a moment to sort of go into some of the more academic stuff here. If I was sort of lecturing to some of my students or class, you'd think, so, what is this? And I try to get some interaction, but it's a webinar, so I'll just do sort of a monologue with myself. What are nature-based climate solutions? And I guess if we think about it, some of you may have heard of climate change. Who knew? This is a hot button issue, and it's quite controversial in different areas. But this idea of climate change, that our climates, our long-term weather is changing and has been impacted or is being impacted by human activity. I grew up on this farm. I left for about 15 years and worked overseas, and across India, across sub-Saharan Africa, outer Mongolia, and also in Europe. I did my PhD in England. And I think what it's shown me is sometimes it's good to get off the farm, for me, if you can, and kind of see sometimes that, there's a lot of us people on this planet. And, we are, gosh, how we change our landscapes is pretty significant. And, I'm not sort of evangelizing on any sort of climate change agenda here. I'm just saying we're impacting this earth. And I think regardless of the reasons for it, this idea of nature-based climate solutions is a way to recognize our federal government, many governments internationally through the Paris Climate Agreements and many since then, have agreed, hey, we want to try to do something to sort of slow down this change because it will have greater negative impacts than positive impacts across the world. And one of the things here is look at what about our natural landscapes? Maybe nature or what we have can be part of the solution to mitigate or to slow down some of the changes that we're seeing globally in terms of warming trends or flooding in certain areas. And so this whole concept, it's kind of simple. We want to use nature, kind of keep some of these places as they are because of the way they're drawing in carbon and doing things like that actually can help both predominantly society, but also individual producers. So that's sort of the context for it. And this is language that I don't know if you hear about that or you have some of your clients reaching out about it, but it's been a theme. I think, we're seeing maybe some changes on that recently, but anyway. And in light of that, sort of in even what I said about what we see globally on change, I work with some folks on sort of mapping, and I'm not an inventory specialist using the satellites, but there's a group out of the US that publish the plow print every year of the Great Plains, of which we are there. You can see Saskatoon and Regina, those little purple spots, and Edmonton and Calgary, and even that Miquelon Lake area just southeast of Edmonton, a little bit of a green spot. And I guess the narrative from this is a lot of good comes from agriculture. We're farmers, we're crop producers, our family, a lot of our income comes from that. But it's come at a trade. There's a trade-off, right? I'm an economist. We have to think of trade-offs. You want to do one thing, it means you actually take a path in the road and you don't actually do the other thing. And we were having a meeting of our sort of crop marketing club here in our village, our town of Kingman, a few years ago. And I remember there was some grumbling because we were getting lots of oil and gas jacks were coming into the area. And, there was, hey, a bunch of the farmers were sitting and said, hey, we need to, they're just messing up this landscape. It isn't the natural landscape that we are taking care of here. And I remember my dad sort of laughed and said, hey, well, guys, let's think about this. True, that is changing, but who's changed this landscape more than anyone else? I said, well, I don't know. Oil and gas. I said, no, we have. We're farmers. We convert it, we plow it up, and we, for good reasons, produce our canola and wheat and peas and all that sort of stuff. But we have impacted our landscape. And you can see that the plow print is in white. Look at Saskatchewan there. There's a lot of agricultural activity. And like I say, a lot of good comes from that, from rural upbringings to feeding and food production, and all that sort of thing. But it has come with a bit of with conversion of many of our natural landscapes. So I want to think about you to hold that context in mind as we move forwards. And to recognize this idea of value, or think about it a little bit. If we were all sitting in the room, I could say sort of, who likes sloughs? You could put up your hand, you could say, ugh. I know a neighbor said to me, he's like, oh, I just hate seeing that slough on the land. It's like if you beef guys were looking at it and you thought, there's a bloated cow just laying dead on the landscape. To me, that's what a slough is. And I said, oh, no, it's not to me. I like that thing. I think it has a lot of benefit. It might mean that you can't get good yields of wheat or canola off it, but there's other things at play. And this is sort of this triangle shows some of the other benefits, I guess, that we see in sort of our natural landscapes, in particular wetlands. And so I think the pink is what we typically think about. What can we get in terms of food or fuel or biomass from it that actually like provision or things that we can eat or drink or that sort of thing. So that's quite a clear one. But then there's these other three triangles in there of supporting services like nutrients and soil formation and photosynthesis that agrologists think about, that soil scientists think about. There's also these regulating services about air quality and erosion control and that sort of to regulate sort of our ecosystem or our environment around us. And then there's some of these things around recreation and ethics and cultural values, that I think, it's hard to, I don't know everyone on this call, obviously, and there's a lot of you. But I imagine if you were like me, raised up in prairie rural Saskatchewan or prairie rural Canada, you don't sort of wax eloquent about sort of, right about all your emotions around these areas that much. Maybe you do. But I think one of the things we do think, though, around things like waterfowl hunting or bush for big game hunting, there's sort of there's a recreation, and ecotourism, and even just knowing that something is there is quite valuable. And so the problem here is we only have a market, and maybe this is something you all know, but we only have a market that really trades the provisioning services. We don't have a market-based system that sorts out those other three very well. So we have this idea of non-markets, the benefits that but really aren't captured in our sort of economic system that we live in today. And so I like this quote from Oscar Wilde that, it's close to St. Patrick's Day, so we can throw in an Irishman, I guess. Oscar Wilde wrote in the 1700s that nowadays people know the value of everything and the price of nothing. Just think about that for a minute. I think it's very true. I think it was true then, and I think it's true today. That we are sometimes, and in economic theory, we think of short-term thinking. We think of short, medium, and long-term thinking. But often our actions are really determined because, I'm probably like some of you, we have bills to pay quite quickly. I saw on your advanced slides, there's something about the salaries of Saskatchewan professional agrologists 2025. So that looked quite cool. I thought I'd go in there and take a look and see where I compare. But we have a lot of demands on our resources, and there's insecurity in the world. So sometimes we just get a price out of something, but we forget about those greater values that exist both to ourselves and our family, but even society. So this comes into play in wetlands. And back in 2011, so look at this, I'm getting old, it's showing that. I did my graduate work in economics with two professors at the U of A. Full circle, I'm now back doing some of this and supervising grad students, and Peter's retired and Vic's still around. But um, I didn't really think about wetlands until Dr. Boxall walked down the hall one day and said, "Hey, you're a farm kid. Do you think you'd want to do some work on wetlands out in Manitoba?" So I'm like, sure, let's do that. And anyway, this led me down a path of, working. We went with about 2,000 Manitoba residents and exploring sort of what they thought about wetlands and how they'd maybe pay money to sort of conserve them. And we found there was a willingness to pay, to use that language, of about $250 a year for 5 years out of taxes that Manitoba residents were willing to pay in this. So fascinating. This is about the benefits. We talked about all that box we just looked at. And yet I wonder if many of you as agrologists, my sort of professional areas as an agrologist are more around economics and rural sustainability, I think is what it is in Alberta, to be a PA. But I work with rural producers and folks that actually maybe are thinking more around the costs. And so I want to touch on that today. And I'm not gonna, put you to sleep with a million journal articles and slides, but these are the three I'm kind of going to highlight today. And this is partners that I want to really, say good things about. I've had a great working relationship with folks from University of Saskatchewan, Pat Lloyd-Smith, Ken Belcher, Liam Bolt was a grad student recently, and did some work published just recently on in agricultural systems on crop yields and ag data using precision agriculture. I did some work here in central Alberta around sort of mapping some with Dr. Sherry Clare, and then did some with Irina Creed from the University of Toronto up in the other. So those are going to form some of the sort of slides I'm going to show next. And I want to acknowledge them. And, I'm one part of a cog. I don't have any illusions of grandeur, just one of many. But I want to show this because maybe this is something, and I encourage you, reach out to me. I have my email at the end, and I could share all these articles with you too. But in 2021, we published this, and we were looking at a lot of people, I say conservation-oriented folks, researchers, organizations will say, "Hey, these wetlands are worth just so much. We have to keep them." And I recognize, and then you have others that are like, they just got to get off the landscape. Different groups of people. So you can imagine people don't always agree. So what we did, there's always talk about this. So we used drones, UAVs, and flew over, I guess my contribution to a lot of this was actually engaging with the farmers directly and getting them willing to share their data because there was a trust established. So we did sort of an in-depth look with three producers here on canola, a quarter section of canola, 3 different ones. And we looked at areas that have been drained and those that were intact. And we did this sort of profitability mapping, which, we just hadn't seen. We had a lot of people talking about it on both sides of the fence, but didn't really have any data for it. And so what we saw in this is a real fascinating trend that, I guess we all know different parts of a field, they don't all yield the same. Wetlands are not all the same. They're a bit different. But on the whole, I think what we saw was a greater risk around the profitability from drained wetlands. It could flood more easily. There's not the sort of the high profitability that you get from it that's sort of been a narrative that we were exploring with a lot of the producers in this area. It was variable, and in some cases they lost money quite consistently. And so that was a fascinating one. I won't linger on this one. I could talk this more on it, but What was intriguing to me too, though, is actually then interviewing these producers afterwards and showing them this data from their own combines and their own sort of the information that they had provided us and saying, look, you're losing money consistently on this area. And I said, wow, yeah, yeah. But I think I'm still gonna drain that sucker. And that was an interesting one that kind of stuck with me. These are great, awesome friends and people that I know and have sort of an environmental bent, right? And so I think there's this idea, especially in sort of um, wet years, you're going around a lot, you're getting stuck a lot, and that takes time and money. So this leads to this other paper that I want to explore. So to dive in a little bit more into sort of precision agriculture, which many of us are using now in our seed drills and combines, and pardon me, and tractors. And I want to acknowledge Liam and Pat, particularly, and Ken, and then the group from PAMI, which some of you might be familiar with. They contributed with this as well. And this is exploring some of this again in a Saskatchewan context. So note this and credit to Liam for some of these slides. I asked him if I could borrow a few for the here. And so it was exploring in the Prairie Pothole region. This is from his just north of his family's farm, north of Saskatoon, looking at and comparing between black and dark brown soil zones. And they looked, this is sort of the context. We do see that there, consolidation and drainage of wetlands occur because of these nuisance and overlap costs. And also land values. I mean, we've seen a huge shift around here. Quarter section used to be about, well, 20 years ago, 100 grand in our area. Now they're up to about $800,000 a quarter. And that's pretty tough for us that want to carry on sort of on sort of a family farm model. It's pretty hard to afford that. And so this is sort of the context as well as this contrasting. They're costly in some ways, but they also provide these benefits. And there is this problem, right? Disparity or difference. Who bears the cost, right? The farmers typically. And who gets the benefits from keeping this on the landscape is, if you think of carbon sequestration or biodiversity, typically it's sort of a larger societal level. It's not that person that owns that 160 acres. And so, we think about all that disparity and sort of want to look even more into, as we referenced the paper that we did with Sherry Claire, analyzing some of that precision agricultural data. And of course, we looked in sort of 16 fields over 7 years in the black soil zone and 20 fields over 4 years in the dark brown soil zone. And then looking at this buffer effect. So what's happening are actually is in dry years, is it increasing the yields or is it actually decreasing yields in wet years? And it's amazing and really impressed with what Pammy and Pat and Ken got for this is, looked at wheat, canola, malt barley, and yellow peas, and a lot of nearly 80,000 wetland and buffer zone yield observations. And I guess what I'm an economist, you get have to have a few graphs in here somewhere. But, this is looking a little more detailed at the mean yield as a percentage of the average field yield and within distance from the wetland. So from 0 meters to 50 meters. And you see that it typically, depending on the year, it's typically a little lower as you're closer to it, but then adjusts. And it varies. Obviously, different crops have better stress tolerance to moisture or drought. Look more into that later if we want. But we put this into a farm financial analysis and model, looking at current sort of these drainage scenarios of as it is, a full drainage or a restoration. And then we looked at the conservation costs. So what it costs to actually conserve these wetlands is the difference in profitability without wetlands. And what we could see here is in this sort of financial analysis is that, in terms of dollars per cultivated acre, that on the whole, I think what we all kind of know in some ways that the whole farm net benefits can improve with, financially alone. You can make a little more money typically by drainage, though there's different scenarios there. And I don't say that, and I think it's important to recognize that. right? That there is a reason, there's a rationality, but what these producers are doing. Because when you're only thinking of that one service, that provisioning service to yourself, um, it does cost them money to make these sort of conservation actions in some situations and cases. And there's lots you can dig into this, but it shows as well though that with precision sort of section control, it actually helps in terms of that sort of they're suitable and they facilitate environmentally beneficial decisions. So they followed up with this, and this is from Dr. Lloyd Smith, some of his work looking at a producer survey showing that producers 38% report higher than average wetland yields, 45% lower than average wetland yields. So isn't it interesting? I guess, and that's the challenge to agrologists, to researchers, to academics, to farmers. In some places it might make sense, in others it doesn't. And so. And even interesting, 15% of folks said they would drain every wetland on their operation if they could without penalty. So you're also facing sort of a cultural, viewpoint amongst some groups of saying, you know what, I just want those off the landscape. And, I think the implications from all of this, as we think about it, for crop producers trying to, maximize their profitability on a given year. There is an element that some wetland drainage can improve profitability, but precision agriculture, and it's been a real boon, I think, that technological advance that can help limit that. But then we think of this thing of, let's not end the story there. And please don't, tune off and leave, say, oh, John said, let's drain. That's the best thing in the world. Because the story is more complex, if you remember my first statement. It's complex, which is different than complicated, which we can get into. But there's a lot going on here that we have to understand. And so if you're only thinking of it in one sort of dimension, then, drainage makes sense. But there's more to it and these other services. So we are carrying on and getting more detailed work with this. And this is a project partnership with the University of Toronto and Dr. Irina Creed, but Pat Lloyd Smith and myself and some of our graduate students are working on a producer survey, crop producers across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And we've just gotten some of the data, and I'm using this with permission from my master's student because this will be some of these will be part of her thesis, so I don't want to, take anything away. So it's sourced there. But we surveyed about 200 producers across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. We looked at who they were, age, farm receipts, and the farm size. And, as you can see, these are larger-ish farms of about averaging around 4,000 acres or so. And then we're looking at rental rates and then the percent wetland coverage. And it sort of shows in that sort of heat map where most of the respondents came from. So a lot sort of in that central Saskatchewan area. And interestingly, it's quite consistent in that, why are you draining? What are you doing here in terms of what are your decisions on your farm? And we looked at, about a quarter of folks across the three provinces had drained wetlands on their property. And these are the reasons for it, which I think were so interesting too. Of course, increase farmable acres. But then you come into this idea of low yields near wetlands. So this narrative then that we have to, that there is sort of that negative impact on yields. So we want to get the water off the land. But then there's also points around nuisance and overlap and fertilizer costs. Fewer people restored and retained. Who knew? But 66% of Albertans, sorry, my video thing is here, and 68% of Saskatchewan producers have retained wetlands on their property. So that's quite significant. Fewer have restored, so that's the lower portion here, but higher have retained. And the big driver here, I think, for retention, it's too costly, not worth it. I think the wetlands that could have been efficiently drained were done so back in the 30s and 40s and 50s when actually there were policies in place promoting drainage. And then, wildlife habitat too was part of it. I think that idea too, that sort of hunting, fishing, and just knowing that there's this narrative of, there is an environmental narrative of stewards of the land that a lot of farmers have. And so interesting, we're digging into each of those quite carefully now as Ashley's finishing her thesis and looking at actually what producers would need to be compensated, willingness to accept to keep landscapes on their wetlands on their property. So, this is like a to be continued, very exciting cliffhanger movie, right? So we're coming through with this, and I want you to, we'll have some really fascinating work coming out of this in the next few months. The other thing I just want to touch on is noting my time too is, some work that we did with Irina Creed at the University of Toronto. Then how do we incentivize restoration of wetlands, especially with this idea of carbon coming into play? And this paper looked a little bit about the mean carbon sequestration rate. So how much wetlands are taking in this carbon dioxide out of the air and storing them in their roots and through the photosynthetic process. And you can look at different time frames. Canada's committed to net zero emissions by 2050. What are the costs of restoring wetlands? They're not that cheap. Costs of restoring can really shoot up. So it's not just plugging a drain, but all those other sort of alternative costs of what's going on. And then this is where we economists came into play. So loved Irina and her team from Toronto for bringing in that biophysical work. But then looking at the benefit cost ratio. And so if it's a 1-to-1, then that's sort of a break even, benefits equal to costs. If it's higher than 1, then it actually wetlands are bringing better benefit on carbon alone, so we should restore them. And you find if, higher prices so the first finding, it is better to protect rather than restore. I mean, isn't it interesting? A lot of academic findings actually kind of make common sense, right? You think we do a lot of analysis to make sure we got the right information in, which is super important. But you come down to this thing, you know what? Once you get rid of something, it's harder to get it back. And I think that really came out in some of these narratives. So if we are serious about some of these carbon sort of values and what's going on, we need to consider some of those policies to sort of incentivize producers. Knowing that's a whole other pretty big topic. But then when we come to restoring wetlands, carbon benefits aren't enough. There's not enough value from the carbon that they come in, noting that carbon rates, sequestration rates vary. I know Dr. Badiou from Manitoba, he's done a lot of work on this. But so the idea is, keep what's there. But then if you think of these other values, so remember these other benefits we talked around earlier of, ecosystem benefits like carbon and hunting values and water control, erosion control and phosphorus reduction, that sort of thing. Then when you bring it in, all of these things here, they can actually increase that sort of value. And Dr. Creed has this sort of an interesting paper here looking at sort of hydrological health and water purification and biodiversity. It's a sort of fantastic sort of wetland function indicator model that provides ranking and scores for sort of a rapid assessment. And I'd encourage you to look at that paper or to reach out to Irina on that one, because it's starting to look at that at sort of at a planning level. And another point I'll mention here that feeds into this, I did some work in 2018, published a paper out of Smith Creek in southern Saskatchewan. And if you look at just, the flooding value, the losses that came about from sort of washed out roadways, municipalities get kind of annoyed about that. They put a lot of money into it. Or sort of those sort of considerations, you see there's some value to retaining, but not to restoring on the whole. And this is over initially in 30 years and discounted over time. But naturally, if you start bringing in all those other benefits, it can shoot that ratio up a lot higher. So to keep what's on the landscape provides $7.70 benefit to $1 investment. And so this is published and has some really good data behind it. Knowing that this is only one watershed, and it might vary, it does vary between watersheds, and it's hard to get all this information. But the point is keep what's on the land. and maybe do some little bits of restoration if you can, but because it becomes much more costly to get those benefits later. But then I want to mention, as we sort of near the end here, you all have done a really fascinating thing in Saskatchewan in the last few years. And what, January 30th? Probably knows the new Saskatchewan Agricultural Water Stewardship Policy just came out and announced by the Water Security Agency. Um, I had the privilege of sort of advising on some components of this and its development. I won't say that good or bad, just I'll just say I was there. Let's not get into some people like it, some people probably don't. Just so you can get mad at me or happy with me, I don't know. But we were looking, this has come into play. And I think the other factor to always think about is if we only focus on sort of incentives and sort of the economic models, we sometimes sort of lose some of that sort of that regulatory context. And Alberta here we have a wetland policy that was put into place by a conservative government in 2013. And it seems, in some ways really good. It's also been, compliance, I think, is an ongoing issue, and even awareness. I talk with a lot of my neighbors out here as, won't name names, but out, doing some draining, and you're like, guys, you better be careful. Like you could get slapped for that pretty hard with some big fines. And in many ways, just didn't even know there was something in place. Manitoba has a policy, and it's really cool that this, Saskatchewan's agricultural water stewardship policy came into play. And there's a lot of, questions around that. It's new and how it rolls out, but that is a factor in decision making for producers. I think it will have to be, just like it is here in Alberta and has been the last 12 years since we've had it. So understanding that policy is important too. And I'm sure for many of you that are advising our clients in the agrology fields to producers, that will be something to learn more of. And then circling back, personal choice. Don't we love personal choice? I mean, we're formed by our societal Western European upbringing, and private property rights and personal choice is a big thing. But I won't get into those sort of theories today. But when a lot of it does just come down to the attitudes that producers have, or landowners or individuals have around it. And I guess now you know where I live, northwest of 28, 48, 19, west of the 4th. But I should take that off. But this is our home quarter. And so we live in that little subdivided area, but we also farm the quarter around it. We bought both from my parents. And when we were struggling for finances, who knew, right? We're mid-30s, rolling back to say, okay, we want to raise our kids on the farm. And it sure be nice to build a house. I'm like, oh, dang, pretty hard. We don't have a lot of money. And this was an interesting thing we followed up with. Well, financially, we reached out to Ducks Unlimited for their wetland restoration program. And we restored 10 acres of wetlands on this home quarter. And the areas of the red dots are where the plugs are, the ditch plugs are. And, we got a check for about $40,000, which was pretty nice. This is the Alberta context, but, it was an incentive for us. Hey, we've put those plugs in, they're filling up, but we are keeping this in sort of hay and pasture, the central portion. And it's been really great for hay production. And yeah, there's water in the spring, but there's sort of more still coming into more the ephemeral side, class 2s and 3s. But it was a help for us, right? We benefited from it. We still get a check each year for 10 years. We will sort of paying out sort of the remainder of that. It was based upon land values in the area, but it was a choice we're happy about. And I guess there's a bit of a bias then too, because I know my grandfather once said to us, we were walking through the fields, he's like, it sucks when we don't, it was in sort of a dry year. And he's like, there are times water matters and water is life for us. And he sort of built that into sort of my understanding. He was an old Swedish farmer in the area. And I look at this is the Miquelon Lake. Corey, you're gonna get it by the end. You're gonna know how to say Miquelon like the best of anyone. But there's three lakes. It's sort of the southern tip of the boreal as it turns down right here on the transition zone. And this is the lake last summer. And when I was a kid, they went up to the trees. When my mom was a kid here, they would be swimming and fishing in this lake. And, there's reasons for this. There is some drainage that was done to make sure the city of Camrose had some water, the nearest large center. I think there's human-induced climate change at play here. And, this lake now, it's one of these alkali prairie lakes. It smells like going canoeing on it right now this is our little guy, Micah, he's 5, and he loves going out there and he loves canoeing, but we're running out of water to canoe on. And even this year, I'm going to have to fence that we own the riparian zone uniquely right to the water's edge. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't want to fence like 2 miles of lakeshore, but it's a challenge because, we're running out of water here. So, I mean, thinking of the future generations. So where do we go from here? I love agriculture. I love sitting on a combine. I love haying. I love raising horses and all this stuff. I like the academic stuff too, but maybe not as much as doing that. And yet I think as I age, I think a lot about our kids and what we're leaving for them. And I think that, making sure there is some pastures, some sloughs, some bush on our quarters that we live and play on is important. And so I think it's complex how we explore these issues. It's complex how we think of profitability, how we model it, how we work within different perspectives amongst, you get 3 farmers in a room, they'll probably all disagree sometimes on things. But it's like, but in some cases it's not complicated. We kind of want to just, have long-term thinking. That old school conservative, small c conservative value, the root of it is to conserve. And I think that's what we're hoping for our kids and for this landscape that we love here. And I hope that some of these, academic papers that I work on don't just sit and collect dust and actually get some use out of them, but and that every little contribution helps as we think of what do we do? How do we wisely conserve this land that we live on and that we gain all our benefit, our livelihoods from? So with that, I will end. Complex, but not complicated. Here are the acknowledgements of all the many wiser people than me that helped on all of this work. And so thankful for them and to all of you for the opportunity to present here or to speak here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for coming and presenting. We do have one question in the chat that I'd like to ask you. So great presentation. What do you think about the politicization and economic viability impact on wetland policies? I'm coming from this notion because it's only Saskatchewan that doesn't have a wetland policy in place in Canada, and that's surprising knowing the impact of wetland and agricultural produce. So it's safe to ask, why do you think it's not being prioritized?
Yeah, thanks for that question. What do I think about it? I think it's a shame that these landscapes are politicized. I really do. For example, we put up solar panels on our farm here, and it's blown my mind how even in the winter we're doing pretty well here. We're making some pretty good money in about I think 14 years. We'll have it all those things paid off, and it's a clear financial win for us on our farm. And yet, solar renewables, they are politicized. And so, I got some friends that drove up one day, some buddies of mine are like, John, what have you done? You've put up solar. Have you gone all, liberal on us or something like that? I'm like, guys, I try to avoid the political conversations as best I can, especially, yeah. And so I said, oh, come on, it has nothing to do with politics. It's a pretty clear financial decision. I can show you our spreadsheet on this, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I also think it makes sense from the environmental perspective, but and I think wetlands are somewhat similar to that. This idea of climate change, it's political, right? It's become political. And I think using the phrasing of sort of extreme weather is much more palatable than sort of climate change right now amongst certain groups, which farmers are typically, we're one of them. And I think that, you know, to get an appropriate wetland policy in place takes it's almost this perfect mix of conditions. Alberta had been working on it since it had an interim policy in 1993. It took 30 years to get our policy, sorry, 20 years to get our policy in place. And I don't think it would fly right now if it was ready to go into place. And that's politically partly. Not that there isn't a great environmental ethic amongst all political stripes, but there was a moment in time that it worked. A conservative government recognized the value of water, especially around groundwater, and said, hey, boom, we can do this. In Saskatchewan, I think you'll notice even the policy that's just out, I think there's a lot of good and hard work went into that. But it isn't phrased as a wetland policy. It's phrased as an agricultural water management policy. Many reasons for that, but I think there's different contexts and time that come into play, and farmers have, you know, a voice. We really do as a community, and sometimes it's you don't want to be told what to do on your landscape, and there's waves, I think, of that happening now. We're in a very different world with politics south of the border and here that are impacting this. So, oh man, I'm rambling. I don't know. Politics are tricky. They do play into this. Facts and science, whatever that means. I've heard that too much probably in the last 5 years. The science says, I try to avoid that phrase like the plague these days because I think there's more to it. I think that's how our human responses, our social responses, and our politics play in a big role. So I think you'll probably have one in the future in Saskatchewan, and this is a good step towards it with the current policy, I think. So,
Well, perfect. Next question. I was wondering, when do you expect the data from your student's thesis to be published?
yeah, thank you. She should be defending next month. So then we will be, I think we're under some pressure to publish as well. So I would imagine by this summer and this fall there'll be something we can share. And I think it's a really great detailed insight and will be valuable to Saskatchewan for all of you, right? We have a good sample of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. We also have Ontario and Quebec too, which is quite cool. So we'll be able to look at farmers in each of those provinces, and I hope that will help inform some decisions and recommendations you can make.
Perfect. Another question. What do you think of the Totluk conservation development? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Totlok, I'm unfamiliar. Can you explain what is the totlok? I guess I don't have
Uh,
I don't have thoughts on
oh,
it.
Tetlock. Sorry, they replied again and said the Tetlock conservation development.
Okay, again, I guess one of the great things is to recognize when you don't know what something is. Can you elaborate? What is the Tetlok Conservation Development? You can
Yeah, if
retell.
somebody asked that question, would they be able to put a little bit more information behind that? That'd be great.
I can Google it on my phone as quickly as I can, but it probably wouldn't be a very informed opinion.
No, for sure. Well, we can ask the next one. So you restored wetlands on your farm. These wetlands were located on pasture. What would you have made this? Would you have made the same choice if it was cultivated land? Why or why not?
Yeah. Great question. Well, we, I like, I'm a scientist at one level, so I like comparing things. So actually, we took the gamble and tried it on 50 acres of really high quality black soil, cultivated area as well on another quarter. And so we did. We made the choice. It has not been the same returns, and not quite. We've just done it. But you know, when I do compare it in our calculations from our farm mapping, we're knowing that it does on average, or will on average, provide higher over 10 years, we'll get more per acre than we would if we would have raised wheat or peas or barley on it. But it did not, it was comparable to a little under what we could make with canola. So that's on our sort of forecasting on our farm models here. So we tried. So the proof is in really the actions, right? Will we do it on more? That's a live discussion that we're having on our operation. So, but thank you for that question.
Oh, perfect. So a little bit more about that question at the Tetlock Conservation. It is a farmer-run drainage management based outside of Grenfell. It is 64 quarter.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I'll just have to say I'll look into that. That's fascinating. I couldn't comment on that right now. Sorry.
Nope, no, that's perfect. Um, but just looking, I think that is all the questions that I see in the chat right now. So again, just want to thank you for coming and presenting at our AGM.
Yeah, no.
Definitely a huge area that myself, I personally know very little about the management styles and how to deal with wetlands. So it's definitely interesting to learn more about that. So again, thank you very much for coming and presenting.
My privilege, and yeah, shoot me a note if there's any questions or information you want, or if you're like, oh, that sucked or that was dumb, you can do that too. We'll sort that out. So thanks for the opportunity, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Okay, and we will have a little short break. We'll be starting up again at 1:45, and we'll be going over the honors and awards presentation, and the AGM meeting will start again, like I said, at 1:45. So we got a quick break here.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Corey.